Okay, good morning, everyone. So it's 9 o'clock. So we'll begin with our webinar for this morning. We will be talking about a very hot topic, very timely with the weather that we're experiencing here in the Philippines. But before we begin, let us all start with a prayer.
Let me be the change I want to see, to do with strength and wisdom all that needs to be done, and become the hope that I can be. Set me free. From my fears and hesitation, grant me courage and humility. Fill me with spirit to face the challenge and start the change I long to see. Today I start the change I want to see. Even if I'm not the light, I can be a spark in faith, service, and communion. Let us start the change we want to see, the change that begins in me. Today I start the change I want to see. Even if I'm not the light, I can be the spark. Faith, service, and communion. Let us start the change we want to see, the change that begins in me. Jesus in us. Jesus in us.
Now, to give us an overview of what the sustainability lecture is all about, let's listen to the Vice President for Research and Innovation of De La Salle University, Manila, Professor Raymond Tan.
Good day, everyone. I'm Professor Raymond Tan. I'm the Vice President for Research and Innovation of De La Salle University in Manila, Philippines. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of the 2024 Sustainability Lecture Series. De La Salle University is a member of a network of Lasallian higher education institutions known as IALU. IALU has member institutions in 5 different continents: the Americas, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Eastern Asia. De La Salle University is a private, comprehensive Catholic university initially founded as De La Salle College in 1911. We are now 1 year removed from our Golden Jubilee as a university and have seen extensive growth in research productivity over the past 50 years. We are ranked first among Philippine institutions in terms of research output in this decade to date. We are the most heavily funded private institution in the country and have seen a 7-fold increase in research output over the past 10 years. As a result, we are ranked by the Times Higher Education World University Rankings of research-intensive institutions, and are also top ranked in the following subject areas: physical sciences, social sciences, engineering, computer science, business and economics, education, and arts and humanities. The Sustainability Lecture Series is inspired by two documents that were published in 2015. Number one, intended for the Catholic world, was Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical. Number two were the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, intended for the secular world. But what is interesting to note is that these two documents have a strong intersection in seeking sustainable development for the entire planet. And these provide the basis for the series of lectures that we've held since 2021. The Sustainability Lecture Series is organized by a core group, initially consisting of Professor Dr. Kathleen Aveso, the current Dean of the Gokongwei College of Engineering, Dr. Carmelita Quebenco, the former President and current Chancellor Emeritus of De La Salle University, Professor Dr. Alvin Colaba, the Director of the Center for Engineering and Sustainable Development Research, which is the organizational host of this lecture series. And we were joined last year with the support of Professor Dr. Aristotle Obando, current Assistant Dean for Research, and former PhD student, Dr. Maria Victoria Migos Umaga, and of course, yours truly. Since January 2021, we've dealt with diverse topics in sustainable development, holding lectures online on various topics at the last Wednesday of each month. The lectures have been recorded for the most part and are available in a dedicated YouTube channel. The lectures have been viewed thousands of times by different viewers asynchronously, in addition to the live audience that we normally have. And of course, the resource persons are drawn from the global IALU network, and we've had speakers from different continents talking about global and local concerns. As we begin a new year, we look at what lies ahead. And first and foremost, we've decided to partner with the newly formed University Sustainability Office at DLSU, which will provide logistical support when we look at new issues, when we consider new formats, including hybrid lectures with a live audience inside the university. So these are what are in store for us in the coming year. Thank you and good day.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So this was supposed to be our first hybrid lecture. Unfortunately, due to the weather, face-to-face work arrangements have been canceled, and so we've decided to shift this lecture online. So today we'll talk about carbon emissions of human activities, and how we can evaluate the carbon emissions of the Philippines. So I will not make the introduction very long, because we all know who our speaker for today is. It's Professor Raymond Tan, a distinguished full professor of the Chemical Engineering Department and a university fellow, and of course, the current vice president for research and innovation of De La Salle University. So I'd like to call Professor Tan. If you have any other details, additional details, or inputs about yourself, please feel free to let us know about them.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to everybody for joining us. If you're in the Philippines on this sweltering summer day, I hope you stay hydrated. This heat can certainly cause non-trivial health issues. So let me begin by sharing my screen. So I hope this is now visible. Kay, can you let me know if that's now visible?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
All right, thank you once again. The title of my talk is The Carbon Footprint of the Philippine Economy. And I'll begin by quoting this excerpt from a 2022 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, stating that the target of safe levels of climate change, which is widely regarded to be about 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of temperature rise by the end of the 21st century. That is what we consider as manageable climate change. This safe target is likely to be exceeded unless we start curbing greenhouse gas emissions rapidly in the coming decades. My talk is organized as follows and is inspired by my concern about the path which the Philippines is headed in particular with respect to climate change. So I'm going to talk first briefly about my background. Just in addition to what was in the introduction, I've been working on climate change for the past 25 years. I started as a PhD student in 1999, just a year or so after the Kyoto Protocol was signed. And my research topic at the time was to look at the environmental sustainability of different so-called future motor vehicle technologies. And one of the dimensions I looked at was the impact on climate change of future motor vehicles. It's interesting to note that the future I envisioned back at the turn of the century is already happening now. We see electric cars and hybrid cars on the roads quite frequently. So that's actually a good development, but we need many more such transitions to take place. So over the past 2.5 decades, I've worked on carbon management in general, developing and using various mathematical techniques, including one of my own personal achievements is the development with my longtime collaborator, Professor Dominic Fu, of something called carbon emissions pinch analysis. And I've amassed quite a body of work on this topic and have been listed in the Reuters list of the 1,000 most influential climate scientists in the world. So we're going to talk next about climate change fundamentals. I think it's important before we talk about carbon footprint of climate change, and it begins with understanding the global carbon cycle. Carbon exists in broadly 3 large compartments on Earth. Number 1 is terrestrial carbon, which includes living things such as humans, animals, plants. That also includes dead biomass, for example, the carbon that is in soil, in forests, and we also have biomass which died a long, long time ago. These are known as fossil fuels, and these are typically found in underground deposits. And then we have mineral carbon, for example, the carbon in carbonates that make up limestone. And then we have carbon in the oceans. And again, this is broadly broken down into living things or once living things, including the detritus that settles at the bottom of the sea. And then we have mineral carbon, which is either dissolved in the water itself or also in the form of solid minerals, again, like limestone, as one example. So that is the second largest compartment, or the second large compartment. The third compartment is carbon in the atmosphere. Most of this in the form of carbon dioxide, which forms a blanket which retains heat and is actually thus driving global warming. And a small amount of this carbon is also present in other compounds, or for example, methane, which is another greenhouse gas, and even smaller quantities of other pollutants. But it's carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases which are a cause for concern because they cause what's called the greenhouse effect. And that means that the radiation from the sun is able to penetrate the atmosphere because of its wavelength, but the
thermal energy that is radiated by the Earth's surface actually is unable to escape to the same level. So the imbalance is what causes the change in temperature, which we call global warming. Now, here's a slide which summarizes what climate change is all about. It's caused, as I said, by an excess of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which causes an energy flow imbalance. If there's more energy entering than there is exiting, then the planet is gradually warming. And we're talking about a very slow process with lots of momentum. So it's very hard to slow it down, even if we make drastic changes. Ultimately, climate change is driven by two major activities of humans. Number one is burning fossil fuels, which is basically us taking carbon, which is embedded in coal or petroleum or natural gas. And when we burn those fuels, what we get is carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere. This is happening at a rate which is much, much faster than the natural accretion of fossil fuel deposits. That takes place over the course of millions of years, and it's not fast enough to compensate for the way humans are just burning up fossil fuels so rapidly. The second major driver is what scientists refer to as land use change, or LUC, what is more colloquially known as deforestation. The destruction of ecosystems will often take carbon stocks that exist in vegetation and in the soil, and that becomes transferred into the atmosphere, also on a large scale. Now, climate change is more than just an issue that environmentalists are concerned with. It actually has palpable impacts on human activities. So for countries that are, for example, typically in the pathways of tropical storms, or which undergo or are vulnerable to drought and water shortages, climate change actually will cause economic damage, socioeconomic damage that people feel. And various research teams all over the world have estimated the extent of damage that's occurring. Nowadays, most estimates that I see actually put the figure at about close to $200 of damage for every ton of carbon dioxide that enters the atmosphere. And the damage, of course, crosses international boundaries. They don't necessarily occur where the emissions come from, and that's distributed all over the planet. This is also known as the social cost of carbon. So if you forget everything else I say this morning, just remember the figure now estimated at $200 per ton. The good news is we're looking at technology shifts which are driving the global response to climate change. For example, renewable energy is becoming increasingly affordable and being used at a larger scale than ever before. I mentioned that we have more and more electric vehicles and hybrids, which, when combined with renewables, will give us mobility that is much cleaner than is possible with the old-fashioned internal combustion engine vehicles. And technologies such as carbon dioxide removal, which are being scaled up rapidly in different parts of the world. This is a snapshot of the problem. Recall the slide that I pointed out, which puts the social cost of carbon at $200 per ton. The amount of carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere is approximately 40 billion tons per year. So if you do the math, at 40 billion tons per year multiplied by $200 per ton, we're looking at trillions of dollars worth of damage that we should expect from greenhouse gases every year. And what we thus have to do on a planetary scale, not even Philippine or national or Asia scale, this needs to be done across the entire planet, is to stop this growth in greenhouse gas emissions. That, by the way, is a trend that goes back throughout all of human history. So we need to stop that, and we need to bring down the 40 billion tons per year currently to 0 tons per year by the middle of this century, or approximately 1 human generation from today. So that is the drastic measure that needs to be taken. This is a drastic measure which more and more countries are taking up through what are known as net zero emission pledges. For example, the European Union as a bloc has made such a commitment. Developed countries such as Japan and the UK have done so as well, and even developing countries like China and India have set carbon neutrality goals as part of their contribution to what we see as a requirement for the entire planet. I will point out that the seriousness to commit to decarbonization is not really uniform. And here we have a snapshot of which countries have very strong carbon neutrality or net zero commitments, and which ones have relatively vague commitments. And of course, at the other end of the scale, we have climate laggards, unfortunately, including the Philippines, which have not yet made any such net zero pledges. And I think this is going to be to the detriment of future generations if we don't make a corrective action. The reason for this is it's not just a political commitment. When you have a net zero pledge, it is more than just politics. It affects the economy and it affects businesses and eventually, of course, livelihood of people who depend on those businesses. Because carbon management is now part of the global business regime. We now live in what we would call a carbon-constrained world. So carbon footprint analysis is something that people should know about. I think it should be part of the general curriculum in many disciplines. Carbon markets and carbon emissions trading is now a reality. Some technologies that we think of as indispensable today will become obsolete in the coming generation or so. And for companies in countries which lag in their carbon commitments or decarbonization commitments, the access to export markets, the access to investors and financing will affect the future growth opportunities. And of course, public perception as well is going to be affected by all of these. So that is why I think the Philippines needs to take decarbonization much more seriously. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we'll look at a computing technique known as environmentally extended input-output analysis. This is an old technique, and 5 years ago, our team at DLSU wrote a book about this, which is actually available in our library and available online as well, if you want a copy. Carbon footprint is certainly, I think, a word that all of you in the audience have encountered before, and I'm sure most of you would have had the occasion to use this in your recent professional work. It's defined by ISO 14067 as follows. It is the sum total of greenhouse gas emissions that we associate either with a product or with an organization. And it's evaluated on what's called the life cycle basis. And that means that, well, I'll explain as we go along. The key words here are greenhouse gas emissions and life cycle basis. When we say life cycle, we can think of a product or a product system as being a chain of activities which we can visualize in a simplified form as shown here. So if you think, for example, of your mobile phone, think of everything that occurs in its life cycle. So if you think of when you first took your phone out of the box, it was actually would have been transported to the retail outlet where you got it. It would have been manufactured perhaps in Taiwan or China or Korea, but the various subcomponents of your phone would also have been manufactured elsewhere. And you can trace this back through the supply chain, and ultimately everything in your phone would have come from the ultimate cradle, which would be some kind of natural resource, whether these are the minerals that go into the metallic components or the fossil fuels that were used to eventually make the plastic components and so on. When you eventually get tired of your phone, you eventually throw it away and it becomes part of the waste material of humanity. And eventually it will eventually be destined to return to the environment in some form whether properly managed or not. As you use your phone, you would regularly plug it in to charge it. It will rely on a cellular network to provide the communication services. So that's actually part of the what's called the life cycle of the phone. And you could actually, not just in theory, but you could in practice figure out, for example, the carbon footprint of every message that you send via SMS or via the internet. And you can actually figure out the incremental damage to the environment that occurs every time you send information via your mobile phone through life cycle analysis. That principle can apply to just about any product you can think of. And we could take a much simpler product. You might use aluminum foil regularly to wrap your leftover food or to wrap your sandwich to take to work. That aluminum foil would have can be traced backwards through a supply chain again that ultimately begins with the aluminum ore being drawn from the ground to make the aluminum in the first place. And if you want the carbon footprint of a roll of aluminum foil, you would have to look at its entire history and figure out or calculate what are the greenhouse gas emissions that are generated in each of the manufacturing steps and the logistics steps to bring the aluminum foil to your kitchen. Now, when we speak of carbon footprint, it's now standard to divide carbon footprint at the level of organizations into 3 levels or 3 scopes. So for any organization, which could be a factory, a corporation, a university, scope 1 carbon emissions or scope 1 carbon footprint refer to the actual greenhouse gases that are emitted directly by the activities of the organization. So a good example here is if you have a restaurant as your unit of analysis, its scope 1 emissions would include the emissions that are generated when they burn gas in their kitchens to cook the food that they serve. So these are on-site or generated directly by the organization's assets. So for example, if you have an airliner, even though the emissions don't occur on-site, if the emissions are generated by the aircraft owned by a particular airlines, then that's part of scope 1. Next, of course, we have scope 2, and these are very simply the carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions attributable to the purchase of electricity and other forms of energy by an organization. And again, we go back to our restaurant example. They burn gas in their kitchens, that's scope 1, but they also buy electricity from the grid, and the electricity comes with its own carbon footprint, even though the emissions take place at the power plants and not in the restaurant itself. So something like that is actually attributable or can be blamed on the organization buying the electricity, and it forms part of their so-called scope 2 emissions. These will generally occur off-site, but because we typically measure the electricity purchases of any organization, these are very easy to quantify. And finally, of course, if you have a supply chain of various goods, and again, keeping to our example of the restaurant, they would buy ingredients and various inputs for the dishes that they cook. So that entire supply chain would have its own carbon emissions. For example, for the vehicles that deliver the produce that goes into the kitchen, that goes into the food. And all of those emissions that occur in the supply chain are part of the so-called scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and scope 2 are relatively easy to measure and calculate. Scope 3 present significant challenges and often would have to be estimated based on typical or average values from representative activities. And this is where computing techniques such as input-output analysis come into the picture. And one of the most common tools used for this purpose is the input-output model that was initially developed by this Russian-American economist, Vasily Leontiev, who won the Nobel Prize 50 years ago for developing this technique. And it's a standard technique that is used by governments all over the world, including the Philippines, including, I'm sure, the countries represented in the audience today. It's quite likely that your government has an official agency that keeps statistics of the country's recent history using the format that was developed by Leontiev. And this is the format. I'm not going to go into the mathematics, except to say that Leontiev won the Nobel Prize by developing a simple way to by network. That simply means that products or goods within an economy are typically passed on from one activity to the next. So think, for example, of corn. Corn comes from farms, and very often the corn is used as livestock feed for chickens, and then the chickens are sold to restaurants again, which then turn the chicken into chicken dishes, which people purchase for their consumption. So that chain of activities, in addition to hundreds or thousands of other similar activities, can be represented in relatively compact mathematical form that you can put on an Excel spreadsheet using the template that Vasily Leontiev first thought of about 100 years ago. And at the heart of the model that he developed is a way to just keep tabs on what you need typically across an entire economy to make one particular unit of product. So if you're thinking of chicken farming as your representative example, it's quite easy to figure out what it takes for a typical livestock farm to raise one chicken from egg to the point where it can be sold for consumption. So to make that one chicken, of course, over the course of the life of the chicken, the farmer would have to buy feeds, various pharmaceutical products, electricity to keep the plant, the farm running. And because these purchases are recorded and reported to the government, eventually at the end of any given year, you can actually get the average performance of chicken farms all over the country based on the aggregate data that's reported by all chicken farmers in a given territory, say the Philippines or some other country. So that sort of record keeping is done for every product that you can think of, every product category. And that's put into an input-output framework, which is then, in most countries, is published on a regular basis. Of course, logging that data does take time. So in the Philippines, the most recent version was published in 2021, so a little bit more than 2 years ago. And that data actually comes from much earlier. That data is from 2018 because it takes a couple of years to verify the data and organize it into proper form. So these input-output tables are actually publicly available via the Philippine Statistics Authority's website, which I'm showing here on screen. And what you can see here is just the upper left-hand corner of a very large spreadsheet with more than 200 rows and 200 columns. In 1970, just when people were starting to realize that environmental issues had to be taken into account, Leontiev developed an extension of his original template model, which we now refer to as economically extended input-output analysis. And all he did was he took the economic accounts and he added what's called the environmental matrix to look at the environmental consequences, which are the consumption of natural resources and the generation of pollutants that result from economic activities. And as a result of his innovation, it actually becomes possible to do short-term forecasts on how much pressure is placed on the environment from changes in economic activity in any given country, including the Philippines. So what I'm going to present would just be the tip of the iceberg. And over the past few months, I've worked on taking the economic data from the Philippine Statistics Authority and the greenhouse gas emissions, or specifically the carbon dioxide emissions that are also reported officially by the Philippine Department of Energy. And I pieced together a very simple model using Leontief's template to figure out the carbon footprint of the Philippine economy. Incidentally, more well-endowed countries have done this on a large scale as well. So there's a team, for example, in the United States Environmental Protection Agency that has done the same thing. So you can actually Google the model that they developed if you want to see the full capabilities. But what we've done in the Philippines, in DLSU, is very similar to what they've done in terms of principles, but the scale with which we've done it obviously is limited by the data availability in official government records. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, the US EPA model is actually also publicly available. So if you're interested in that, you can use that. I do know that their model has been used by many firms in the US as part of their carbon footprint analysis. Amazon is one of their users, for example. So these models are more than just academic curiosities. They can actually be used by companies who are doing carbon footprint analysis for internal diagnostics. So this chart shows us the carbon intensity of the Philippine economy. And we show here the 16 major sectors that are based on the classification used by the Philippine Statistics Authority. So starting from agriculture on the left, all the way to various services on the right-hand side of the chart. The carbon intensity here is reported, if you look at the vertical scale, that is in kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions only from burning fossil fuels per peso. And we see in this histogram, we see two data sets. One would be the direct or production-based intensity shown by the blue bar. And the second is the consumption-based carbon intensity, also known as carbon footprint, which is shown in the brown bar. And please take note that the vertical scale of this chart is actually logarithmic. So each increment here represents a tenfold increase from the previous one. And we can see then that carbon footprint is if you as a consumer or as a citizen would spend a given amount on a particular product or service. For example, if you purchase a telecommunication service through the internet, through an internet service provider, we can see here that roughly in the middle column, we're looking at carbon footprint of close to 0.01 kilograms, or maybe about 70 or 80 grams of carbon emissions per peso. So if you multiply that by how much you're paying your internet service provider at home to keep you online, that gives you a sense of the carbon footprint that is incurred by your purchase of telecommunication services. So similarly, you can do that for just about anything you purchase, including if you're a student at a university and you're paying so much for tuition and fees, then in principle, it is possible to estimate the carbon footprint of your education each year or each semester. Let's zoom in on specific services. And I started with speaking about restaurants earlier in my talk. This is the typical food establishment in the Philippines. So if you were to imagine going to a restaurant today, partly to cool off, partly to get a nice meal for yourself, and let's say you spend 1,000 pesos for that meal, the carbon footprint on average for the typical establishment in the Philippines would be about 4 grams or 0.004 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions per peso that you spend. So if you spend 1,000 pesos, that means that you're using up typically about 1,000 times this value. So maybe 4 kilograms of emissions per 1,000 pesos in a typical food establishment in the Philippines. How is that distributed? Where does the carbon footprint come from? Here we can actually see the breakdown. And you can see that in this pie chart, a very large slice of the pie, roughly about 70%, comes from electricity. So that's because, say, you're The establishment could be air conditioned. They certainly have lighting. Some of their equipment in the kitchen would be running on electricity as well. So most of the carbon footprint that is incurred actually takes place off-site because they're using up electricity that comes from a power plant somewhere in the grid. And we can see that there are other contributors to the carbon footprint, including the blue slice on the left is transportation and storage, because of course their raw materials and ingredients are shipped through a supply chain and so on and so forth. And you will see here that only a small portion, less than 15%, actually comes directly from their own in-house activities, where they burn gas or some other fuel to cook the food that they serve you. So the lesson here is, just because you can't see the emissions at the point of purchase doesn't mean they don't exist. The second lesson is that there's a strong interdependency across sectors of the economy that will affect the carbon footprint of specific sectors. Let's have a look at manufacturing. It's a very similar picture, as you can see here. For any product that's manufactured in the Philippines in a factory somewhere in this country, we see that we have about 6 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per peso, peso value of whatever product you're making, whether it's a bicycle or a car or semiconductor goods components. Again, about 60% of this comes from electricity. A large slice, roughly about 35%, comes from manufacturing itself. These are either scope 1 emissions, these are the company's own emissions when they manufacture the product, or from their suppliers in their supply chain. And smaller slices would come from elsewhere, from logistics and from other activities. What we can see from both of those examples is that the emissions from electricity provides the lion's share of emissions of the carbon footprint of the products and services in the Philippines. And it's actually quite alarming that at the moment, we've had an upward trend going back roughly about a decade of the Philippines' electricity carbon intensity creeping upwards slowly but steadily. So every now and then, of course, we benchmark with other countries, and in many parts of the world, the trend is actually in the opposite. Countries are cleaning up their grids by installing more solar or wind or hydro electricity and using those to displace fossil energy. In the Philippines, we have been going in the opposite direction and becoming increasingly dependent on coal and natural gas for the production of electricity. And that's going to be to the detriment of Philippine industry in the future, because the carbon footprint of the products that we make will be going up in tandem, in lockstep with the grid electricity. So here's a simulation of what happens using the same model that I showed you. If we were to decarbonize the grid in the Philippines, the carbon footprint of Philippine manufacturing would decline as shown here. So status quo, as I showed you, it's about 0.006 kilograms of carbon dioxide per peso. If we were to completely run our electricity using solar, wind, and renewables, we would bring down the carbon intensity not to zero, but less than half of what it is now. And of course, we would get intermediate reductions in carbon footprint of manufacturing for intermediate levels of cleaning up our electricity. But the point here is the electricity does need to be cleaned up if we want our products as a country to be competitive in a carbon-constrained world. So let me now proceed to discuss briefly the economic implications of decarbonization and, by extension, of failure to decarbonize the economy. The most recent Philippine Energy Plan of the Philippine Department of Energy gives a forecast through to the end of 2040 of how the Philippine energy mix, or how we make electricity on average in this country, will evolve over the coming decade and a half. There is actually a Philippine Development Plan update, which is in the works. It has yet to be put on the website of the Department of Energy. but that one makes projections all the way to 2050. The problem with the current energy plan as we see it is that even though there's some effort to decarbonize a bit, it actually falls short of what is being done in many parts of the world. By 2040, this document projects that even by then, half of the electricity generated in the Philippines will still come from fossil fuels like coal and natural gas. Which begs the question, will the high carbon footprint of Philippine products, as a result of the carbon footprint of our electricity, have an adverse effect on the competitiveness in export markets in the coming decades? We could look at economic activities and sectors which are naturally transboundary. So if you think of logistics, if you think of the maritime industry or the airline industry, these are naturally not just restricted to Philippines in their activities, but they would cross over to other countries. If we look at shipping specifically, the shipping industry globally contributes almost 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And if you think of how every product is probably going to be shipped from one country to another, again, think of your mobile phone. It would have been shipped in a vessel like this from where it was manufactured to where it was eventually purchased. So the carbon footprint of every product you can think of would actually have a contribution for maritime transport. At the same time, the International Maritime Organization has taken serious measures to have benchmarking among peers on the carbon or climate friendliness of ocean-going vessels, including those from the Philippines. So again, this begs the question, will the carbon footprint of Philippine vessels and maritime companies affect their access to economically significant ports in the future? In other words, if you're unable to decarbonize your fleet as a shipping company, perhaps you'll be locked out of places like Rotterdam or Tokyo and be relegated to less economically important shipping routes in the future, or be locked out entirely, perhaps. So those are risks that we need to think about. The same risks, of course, will apply to airlines and such companies as well. Now, I spoke earlier of the emerging carbon dioxide removal economy, which is taking shape all over the world. A recent projection by McKinsey and Company projected that this is a growth industry that by 2050 will breach the $1 trillion scale per year. That's the amount of business that will be taking place just trading carbon credits from one company to the next. And that would include revenues to companies that sell carbon credits, and this will include middlemen, consultants, auditors, verifiers of carbon credits and such. So that's a huge market. So potentially there is room for Philippine companies to stake their claim in this growing market. Just a small slice of the $1 trillion industry would be significant. So I would ask then, an opportunity raises itself. Can CDR become a major business sector in the Philippines? A CDR, as I said, is not just an academic curiosity. There are actually companies as we speak which have started to produce carbon credits through engineered means, such as this photograph that you see on your screen. This is a company called Climeworks, and they produce carbon credits with this facility and sell those credits to other companies that are trying to decarbonize their operations. So you could think of this as a form of outsourcing. In addition to engineered decarbonization techniques, you could also explore nature-based solutions such as afforestation and reforestation, or coastal ecosystem management, so-called blue carbon management. So all of these potentially could be scaled up. And if you could verify these credits, you could actually sell them to companies. And in a sense, you could get financial support. You could get companies to pay you to reforest or to manage mangroves because they need the carbon credits or they need to offset their emissions. So let me now proceed to my conclusions so that we can have a reasonable Q&A. The punchline is very simple. The Philippines must commit to carbon mitigation. And the reason for this is the global community has already taken serious steps to decarbonize. We know that on a planetary scale, we need to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions by roughly about 2050, or one generation from today. Many more countries, actually majority of countries on Earth, have already at least strategically made a commitment to do so. So that provides a top-down signal, even though it's not sure exactly, we're not sure how to do it in any given country. That provides a bit of a signal to companies to start thinking of future investments. And if a national government fails to do this, you're failing to give the signal to companies and citizens to start thinking ahead 1 or 2 or 3 decades. And you run the risk of what is known as a carbon lock-in, which could have dire economic consequences, which would be very difficult to reverse because of investments in technologies that eventually lead you down the wrong path. And finally, of course, I've been working for 25 years on mathematical models, rather, for carbon management. These models provide insights on how we can make better choices and better policies, especially for serious issues like climate change. That concludes my talk. These are my contact details. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions in the future. But if you have any immediate questions, I will be happy to take them this morning.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Tan. Yeah, I think we have a lot of questions, both at the in the Q&A chat box and okay, hold on. Am I okay, frozen? All right. So let's take the question from Benja, Doc Benja. So what policy or technological intervention should our country focus on so that we can cope up with our decarbonization commitments?
The argument that I made in my talk today, which was published in my co-authors, Dr. Lisa and Dr. Magang, in January of this year, is there needs to be an ambition, a global, or rather a national net zero edge is going to be solved at least as an aspiration of the Philippines collectively to do what the rest of the world is doing. That if majority of countries in the future are going to decarbonize, we would like to make our own contribution to that global effort. And that then will cascade down the different regulations that will, for example, influence future Philippine energy plans. Maybe there would be a stronger shift towards renewables or non-fossil based electricity generation that would then provide signals, for example, for companies to invest in electric vehicles for their vehicle fleets and so on and so forth. And the second would be, I think, as I mentioned, CDR is going to be big business in the future, and the Philippines is not going to be exempted from this. What is going to be in question is whether Philippine companies will be forced to buy credits from overseas, or if we'll have a local supply of companies that start taking up this opportunity to create carbon credits and allow companies to buy these credits for outsourcing of decarbonization. So, but there needs to be there probably needs to be some kind of regulation to enable this to happen.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah. The next comes from Crispian Lau, sorry. How can we ensure that the science as presented here is disseminated and applied on decision and policy making to ensure that there is no multimedia transfer of environmental impacts resulting to increased greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint contributions? As governments are geared towards reduction and regulations of consumption of locally produced and at times recyclable single-use plastics, the alternatives often applied are imported and disposed without proper facilities, including its effects on water, wastewater, um, are not recovered for recycling. Okay, one specific example will be polypropylene food trays, takeout boxes, where the entire life cycle from resin production to recycling is locally in place and replaced with perceived biodegradable, compostable, renewable, but not recyclable, given the absence of local infrastructure.
Yeah. Thank you for that
Okay,
question.
that's that.
That's actually an excellent example of what I was talking about. That's called technology lock-in. When your entire supply chain becomes geared towards a particular technology, that then becomes problematic. So, for example, plastic waste is a huge problem in many parts of the world. But because there are so few alternatives and because no single company can unilaterally change to an alternative because of the absence of options, that locks in the entire system, that locks in the entire country. The same thing can happen uh, with the climate change as an issue. If we fail to adequately decarbonize our electricity production, a company that requires electricity for its operations is going to be locked in. And that means that even if they wanted to decarbonize because they're in the Philippines and they're relying on electricity, which is fossil energy based, that's going to prevent them from doing deep decarbonization. The consequences that we should consider are that it is possible and actually plausible that 1 or 2 decades from now, it would be more than just the cost of electricity that would be a consideration for companies to invest in large manufacturing facilities in the Philippines. They might actually begin considering what's the carbon footprint of your grid. Because whatever carbon footprint in the grid exists will become the carbon footprint of this company. And that could actually make the Philippines even more unattractive to foreign investments. And thus we lose opportunities for job creation and improving livelihood opportunities. So that's what I meant by lock-in. Now, finally, of course, what can be done here is in our own modest way are to capitalize on the so-called public engagement and science to policy interface through events such as this. And last month, I was involved in a UK government-funded science to policy workshops. One was held in the Philippines, the other was held in Malaysia, and was supported by the Philippine government. Sorry, the UK government, rather. The intention was to relay this kind of information and have a dialogue with stakeholders in both government and industry in both countries. So that was a moderately successful event, but we need more of those and basically just knock on the doors and hope eventually that this information will reach the ears of people who make decisions, whether it's in industry or in government.
Okay, thanks. Our next question comes from Anna Maria Veronica. So, can you comment on how environmentalists noted how Marcos put renewable energy at the top of his agenda, but has outlined his plans for nuclear and fossil gas first?
Well, this is why we're waiting for the Philippine Energy Plan. That's still in the works and has not been released. Definitely, we know that we need to explore alternative non-fossil energy options. The amount of coal we've been using has been creeping upwards for many years. The reason for this is it seems to be, at least if you don't count the cost of pollution, it seems to be the cheapest option available. That again leads you down the road to the kind of technology lock-in that I was speaking of. So it's good that there's an initial signal or declaration that we need more renewables, we need more low carbon options. Eventually, the road to doing that is going to be mapped out in something called the Philippine Energy Plan, which we're awaiting. And I hope that the next version is better than the previous one. Finally, one more thing I'd like to point out is if you build a power plant today, it's likely going to still be around 30 or 40 years from now. That's how long power plants last. So a decision, this is why the declarations and the commitment to decarbonize need to be made well in advance, because every time you build a facility, whether it's coal-fired or gas-fired or a wind farm, you're going to be stuck with it for 3, 4, maybe 5 decades even. And therefore, you're not going to be able to change so easily midstream once you've committed your resources to a particular technology. So that's an example of lock-in, which we should be trying to avoid by anticipating the future.
Okay, thank you. We still have a lot of questions. Can I take the last question because it's already 10 a.m. So this is from our chat box from Jeremy. So there are actually four questions. The first one is, what scale of organizations are currently required by law to adhere to carbon limits? The second
All right.
one is, how
Sorry.
can we calculate? Oh yeah,
Okay. Sorry.
we'll
Can
take it
we
one at a
pause
time.
with each questions
Okay.
because
All right. All right. All
I'm
right.
going to forget.
Okay.
Currently, there are no regulations. There are no mandated caps on carbon emissions for companies in the Philippines, but there is actually a regulation for, at least for large companies, to report annually, to have a sustainability report, and that could include carbon emissions. So at the moment, rather than having hard regulations on this, it's a bit like an economic incentive, because the thinking nowadays with sustainability reporting norms is that cleaning up your operations will open more opportunities for your business in the future. So that's the carrot that's driving this for the time being.
Okay, the next one is, how do we actually calculate the carbon limit of a particular business? Is it a function of an establishment's revenue or the type of sector, or are there any other factors that need to be considered?
Again, I would not use the word limit simply because there are no regulations about this. But what can be done in principle, and in the Philippines, and has been done in many other countries, is looking at the typical carbon emissions of companies in a particular category or group. So, for example, you could do carbon emissions of airlines in general, and people have done this in the US, in Europe. So any given airline can actually benchmark their performance relative to industry norms, and they can find out whether they're leading or lagging relative to the average level. So that's how it's done. And of course, any individual company can measure their unique carbon footprint or the average for their industry using the model that I showed you in my presentation. But please note, it's not about limits at the moment. It's about industry norms. I should add one thing about not limits, but targets. Many international groups, for example, in the case of the aviation sector globally, and in the case of maritime shipping globally, the organizations that are made up of shipping companies from all over the world actually have voluntarily set progressive targets to gradually decarbonize the emissions of their member companies over the coming decades. So these are voluntary. They set their limits based on consideration of what's technically feasible, what's reasonably in step with the need to decarbonize, but at the same time is not going to drive them out of business. So these are basically, that's based on peer pressure. So if you have 100 companies all over the world saying that it is feasible for us to cut our emissions by 20%, then a Philippine company that's a member of that organization either needs to keep up with the global norms, or would be considered as lagging and may lose business opportunities in the future just because of peer pressure or peer performance benchmarking.
Okay, sorry, just one final question that's supposed to, capture some of the other questions that are in here. Can you give us or talk more about how carbon credit business works? There's some questions regarding how is it verified, how do you ensure that there is no double counting, and how reliable are the carbon dioxide removal technologies in terms of providing available carbon credits?
Thank you for that. That's certainly a good question to end on. This is an emerging ecosystem, but it's actually based on the principle that we have buyers of credits, we have sellers of credits, and as with any other business, there are middlemen, companies which play the role of matchmaker and companies that play the role of auditors in quotation marks that provide verification services. And what that means basically is uh, the middlemen and the auditors provide the check and balance. So that means that you can't just make up credits or double count and sell that, because there are actually companies that are being paid to check on your activities to provide the buyers with a reasonable assurance that whatever they buy from you is actually legitimate. So there are companies that specialize in that. They, of course, as with other middlemen and other auditors, they get paid as part of the transaction. They get a small slice to run their operations. So that's how it's done.
Okay, so thank you so much. That's all the time that we have for this morning. Dr. Tan, do you have any additional parting words for our audience before we end?
Yeah, very quick parting words. There is no alternative. The Philippines needs to decarbonize its economy to keep in step with the rest of the world. And the only alternative is to be behind the rest of the world, which is certainly not acceptable.
So thank you once again. And for our audience, if you have any other questions for Professor Tan, please feel free to shoot him an email. Maybe Dr. Tan, you can put it in the chat box should anyone want to send you an email.
Let
And
me let
of
me
course, yeah, go on.
all right. Let me put my
And
email address in the chat box.
all right. So we'd like to hear from you. Please give us your feedback regarding this talk. And if you have any other suggestions for future talks, you may scan the QR code or go to the link indicated in this slide. So we'll be sending an email to let you know when the next sustainability lecture will be. So thank you once again to everyone for joining us this morning.
Thanks very much. Thank you.